Today we're going to replace the lower ball joints on the 280ZX here, and I've already got it up on jack stands, wheels off, and I'm just going to show you what we're going to replace right here. It's down at the base of the strut right here. We're going to replace this right here, and I don't know if you can tell, but mine is really torn up and I've got a lot of play in there. The first prep step for this is to disconnect the tie rod from the knuckle arm here, and I have a separate video on replacing that tie rod. Just watch the first part of that and you'll see how to take that off. It's very simple. You just remove that castle nut and cotter pin and use a ball joint separator and you can pop that out. The next step before doing anything else is going to be to come up underneath here at the front end of the tension control rod, and you're going to loosen up this nut. You're not going to take it off, but you're going to loosen it and then thread it as much as you can, because we're going to need play right here to reinstall everything. If you do not do this now, it will be almost impossible to do it if you've disconnected the other end of the TC rod, as we're going to do later. So before you disconnect anything down by the ball joint, loosen up that nut. Next, we're going to go for these two 17mm bolts that hold this lower part of the suspension to the strut tower. So there's one on this side and one on the other side of the tower. We're going to remove both of those. Once those two bolts are out, you'll just be able to rotate this steering knuckle down here, and you'll see that the castle nut at the top of the lower ball joint was in there, and we can just kind of work this strut up and kind of move it over to the side just out of the way. If you look from underneath here, there are three 14mm bolts holding the ball joint in place. This is the TC rod over here. You're going to want to loosen all three of these up and remove them almost all the way. Now we pry out this cotter pin right here and undo this castle knot. This knuckle arm is going to want to move as you turn this. There's about probably 80 foot-pounds of torque you're going to need on here. So to keep this from moving, I just take this punch and put it into this slot so that this is going to keep the whole assembly from moving. It'll just kind of bump into this arm as I'm turning it, and we'll remove that nut now. Next, we'll just finish removing these three bolts that we had loosened before. Once those three bolts are off, this whole thing's going to come out together as one assembly, the lower ball joint and then the knuckle arm, and we're going to take this far away from the car to separate them. I've got my ball joint separator on this assembly. I'm going to crank here. That's going to make this pop, and this old ball joint is going to shoot out that way like super hard. And so make sure that you're not going to hit your car or hit somebody else or hit a neighbor. Make sure there's a safe way for it to shoot. I don't do this inside the car while everything's still attached here, because I don't want the knuckle arm to fly upwards and hit something in the car. So I just took this far away to work on this out here. This old ball joint was in there so tight, it actually broke my puller. The metal of the puller just split before this came out, so I had to go ahead and get one of these to use instead, and I just braced this, put this in a vise essentially, and used a impact drill on this to just cram this thing out. So it's out. In order to make sure the new ball joint doesn't get messed up by the strut pushing on it, as you'll see when we try to install it, I put the knuckle arm first. It's just loosely on with this castle nut, not tightened down, just so that this is protected, and we're going to go work that into the car now. If you have trouble getting these to line up and there's just too much tension working against you here, you might want to remove your sway bar end links. And then here you can see this lower ball joint is just going to slide in right here, and then we'll bolt it from underneath with those three 14mm bolts, or if your ball joint came with new bolts, you can use new ones as well. Removing this sway bar end link in here really does make life a lot easier, so just go ahead and do that. Then it's kind of a piece of cake to line up all the holes from the control arm all the way through up to this ball joint, and then just put these three bolts in. You don't have to tighten them down to spec. We're not going to torque anything to spec yet until we're basically done. So we're just going to get everything kind of put together. The one that we have to torque to spec is going to be the castle nut, so let's go to that one. This castle nut at the top of the lower ball joint is the one thing you're not going to be able to get to when everything's put back together, because it's going to be inside the strut assembly. So you need to torque this down to about 80 foot-pounds, And then make sure that you have an alignment for your cotter pin hole. So you might need to, adjust it a quarter turn or whatever to get in there and insert the cotter pin. Once you have that castle nut reinstalled on here, just kind of work the strut back over onto the top of it. Shouldn't be too hard. You have, again, just to reattach these two bolts right here, one on this side of the strut, one on the other, and then you need to put your sway bar and link back together and reinstall that, assuming you took that off to line everything up properly. After that, we'll just tighten everything down to specification. Once you have everything put back together, go ahead and torque everything to specification. All the torque specs are in the description of the video. And also make sure that you remember to tighten that nut at the front of the tension control rod that you loosened up previously. We also have to, of course, attach this outer tie rod right here. Just remove the calcer nut, stick it in there, put it back in. Again, torque that to spec as well. I have a separate video on that.